So David Davis.
Yesterday, the New Yorker magazine published a 13,000-word inquiry into the Lucy Letby trial, which raised enormous concerns about both the logic and competence of the statistical evidence that was a central part of that trial. That article was blocked from publication on the UK internet, I understand, because of a court order. Now, I'm sure that court order was well intended, but it seems to me in defiance of open justice. Would the Lord Chancellor look into this matter and report back to the House?
When Lucy Letby was convicted of murdering 7 newborn babies and attempting to murder 7 more, she became Britain's most prolific baby serial killer. Only the 4th woman ever in British legal history to be handed a whole life order. She is as reviled as Cromwell Street killer Rose West and Moore's murderer Myra Hindley, despite repeatedly protesting her innocence.
But recent reporting, including by the Telegraph, has raised questions about the evidence heard at her trial. An inquiry has been opened into how the NHS handled the case, with hearings starting this autumn. And now the Conservative MP David Davis has put his head above the parapet on the issue.
The MP is going to be doing his own investigation into Letby after being contacted by numerous experts with their concerns. He is planning to table a series of parliamentary questions about the case in September if he thinks a miscarriage of justice has taken place. He joins us on today's Daily Tea to talk us through what we know about the evidence against Letby and the questions that still need to be answered. Welcome to the Daily Tea with me, Camilla Tominey.
And me, Gordon Rayner.
Gordon, let's start in July 2018, when a 28-year-old neonatal nurse called Lucy Letby is arrested on suspicion of murdering the babies in her care.
Hello, Lucy, is it?
Yes.
Hello, my name's Chester, please. Can you step in 2 seconds?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you got a problem?
It's just after 6 a.m. in Blacon, on the outskirts of Chester. The sun has barely risen, but a woman wearing a blue tracksuit opens the door of her home and greets 2 policemen standing outside. That grainy audio is from the police body cam footage. Her face falls slightly as they ask to come inside, but she doesn't look that surprised. When she emerges from her house flanked by an officer, Letby looks distraught, but she doesn't actually say anything apart from when she gets into the unmarked police car.
I'm going to put you in the back seat over here. Hold on, man, so
Yes.
get the seat there. Okay, just take a seat in there for me, Lucy. I'll move that seat forward a bit. Sure. Yeah, I've just had knee surgery. So. Oh, right, okay.
So that audio, I think, is very interesting and probably influenced a lot of people's opinions of her because she doesn't seem very surprised. I think that a lot of people will have seen that and heard it at the time and thought, that's not how I would have reacted if the police had turned up at my door and arrested me. I think what we have to remind people, though, of is that she already knew she was under investigation. She'd been suspended for quite some time at that point. So I think, in fairness, it wouldn't have been much of a surprise to her that the police turned up on her doorstep. She may have been preparing herself for that moment for quite a long time.
Also, I suppose some may see her as sort of cold-hearted, cold-eyed and not showing any emotion. Others might interpret it as somebody in a deep state of shock, not really knowing what on earth was going on. Fast forward 5 years later, and in August 2023, Letby is convicted of murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder 6 others while working at the Countess of Chester Hospital. This is what Mr. Justice Goss said when sentencing her.
This was a cruel, calculated and cynical campaign of child murder involving the smallest and most vulnerable of children, knowing that your actions were causing significant physical suffering and would cause untold mental suffering. You created situations so that collapses or causes of collapses would not be obvious or associated with you. You removed and retained confidential records of events relating to your crimes and checked up on bereaved parents. There was a deep malevolence bordering on sadism in your actions.
She tried to appeal the conviction, but that was roundly rejected by the Court of Appeal.
Well, let's bring veteran Tory MP David Davis into the conversation now. So I suppose the question for you, David, is why have you put your head above the parapet to have a look at this again?
Well, the reason I asked Alex Chalk that question was because I'd been rung up the day before by a previous science advisor to Number 10, a man who's got a very forensic brain, and he drew my attention to the 13,000 word article. I couldn't get it, and I eventually got a copy, and it was quite persuasive that there were problems with this trial. And I thought, well, why should we know about it? Which is why I asked the question of Alex. What was interesting, however, and at that point, look, I mean, like nearly everybody in the country, I thought, this woman's killed 7 children, tried to kill more. She should go to prison forever, which is in fact what she had that sentence. But having seen this, I thought, well, it's slightly worrying. And then all of these emails and telephone calls started arriving. And they weren't from conspiracy theorists. They were from a past president of the Royal Statistical Society. There was from somebody who was a very senior neonatologist, from nurses, lawyers, you name it. And I thought, wow, this is not normal. This is not what you normally get with this sort of thing at all. And there are real concerns about the evidence, and indeed the ability of the British judicial system to cope with statistical evidence and to cope with scientific evidence, and even how we employ expert witnesses. I didn't realise, actually, and I've been involved in court cases for a long, long time, I didn't realise actually that the expert witness is employed by the prosecution in this case, and so that builds in a bias. So all those things started me to worry about this case.
So David, as you sit here now, is it your position that you believe that Lucy Letby is innocent, or is it just that you are troubled by the trial and you're worried that she didn't receive a fair trial?
Well, I'm pretty sure she didn't receive a fair trial. I can go into that in detail. I'm not sure she's innocent. Let's put it plainly. Indeed, I'm spending the days around us sitting here, the last couple of days and the next day, actually interviewing lots of expert people, not necessarily people involved in the trial, but people who've seen all or part of the trial, about where the weaknesses are. And I have to tell you, every single person I've interviewed has made me more and more worried, more and more certain that this is actually a mistrial. Whether it's a mistrial that got the wrong outcome, we don't quite know yet. Now, for me to do anything about this, I've got to be at least 3/4 persuaded that she's innocent. And I'm going through this process. I'll probably have to read millions of words of evidence over August, as much as I can get the transcript and so on, and all the other documentary evidence. And I'll come to a conclusion in probably September or maybe October. But if I do come to the conclusion that I think she's innocent, I'll be raising it in Parliament and seeking to get what's called a CCRC referral, a Criminal Case Review Commission referral. That's been in the news recently in the Telegraph, in fact, over the Malkinson miscarriage, which was 17 years late.
The man who was accused of rape and then...
It turned out he wasn't.
Yes.
Turned out he was innocent.
We're going to get on to your questions about the evidence and why you find some of the evidence that was presented at the trial troubling. Before that, though, are you not risking sort of being compared to Lord Longford on this? Famously supported Myra Hindley. You're standing up for somebody who has been accused, convicted and refused a appeal on the basis of absolutely heinous crimes. Yeah.
That's why I want to be more than just worried about the mistrial. I want to be at a point where if I come to the conclusion, she's probably guilty, I'll let it go. In truth, if I come to that conclusion, because it's not just. I mean, my reputation is neither here nor there. There are other painful prices for this. I mean, the people whose children were involved in this, the 7 who is alleged were murdered, and the others who it's alleged were attempted murder. It would be painful for them, and you don't want to put them through yet another thing unless it's really, really wrong. But on the other hand, if I were a parent of one of those children and this had happened, I would want the truth. I want to know, if it wasn't Letby, then was it because the hospital wasn't up to it, or whatever other alternative argument might be. So you're right This is a really quite a big decision for me. But I'll make one other point to you. I mean, I've handled lots of miscarriage of justices over the world. You've reported on a number of them. And in early stages of every single one, the victim is unpopular. I mean, let me give you the easiest example. The postmasters and postmistresses. In the early days of the postmasters scandal, the postmistresses were hated in their villages because people thought they'd stolen the pensions and things, you know. And you have to be frankly tough enough to go through that, which is why you've got to be sure from the beginning, or reasonably sure from the beginning.
Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty of people's issues with the trial, David. The subject was covered on this podcast a few weeks ago. Let's hear from Martin Evans, our crime editor, on why he thought the evidence was problematic.
I think there are members of the public who are concerned about the evidence. The scientific community have concerns. I spoke to a criminologist, Professor David Wilson. His view was that, was justice done? Probably. He said he couldn't go any further than that. I think it's such an unusual case, this, because there was never any smoking gun. In most murders, there is DNA evidence, there's CCTV, there are witnesses. There's a whole raft of things that can persuade a jury. This case was very unusual because you're asking the jury to convict a young woman of the most horrendous crimes imaginable without that smoking gun, without that DNA evidence. And I think, you know, it was a 10-month trial. The jury spent many weeks deliberating and came back with, lots of guilty verdicts. Though it's important to say she was found not guilty of 2 of the charges, and there were a number of charges that they couldn't reach verdicts on, but the majority of the charges were guilty verdicts.
So we've got concerns that have already been raised by the New Yorker and indeed the Telegraph's deep dive piece into the evidence about shift patterns, about the evidence relating to air embolisms in the babies, about the evidence relating to the tampering of food packs with insulin, eyewitness testimony saying that she'd been caught virtually red-handed, the use of expert witnesses, and indeed talk about the neonatal unit struggling quite badly. David, which piece of evidence or which tranche of evidence troubles you the most?
The 2 big pieces of evidence, I mean, you're right, there is no smoking gun, by which, for your listeners, we should say she's never seen doing any of the things that she's supposed to have done. Not once, all right, in all this process. And the judge actually told the jury, you didn't have to have seen her if you believed she intended to do it and if the evidence indicated it happened from somebody. So, but that's in a sense almost secondary. The big evidence, the thing that persuaded the jury from the beginning, was a roster, was a table of when these things happened, or were alleged to have happened, to the 7 children in particular, but others as well, and who was on duty. And according to that roster, Lucy was on duty she was the only person on duty for everything, right? Incredibly persuasive, you would think. Incredibly persuasive. But that's what the statisticians, and I mean really world-class statisticians, got in touch with me and said, no, this is a famous fallacy, right?
Is this the Royal Statistical Society we're talking about?
Those sorts of people and others like them. I mean, it's become across the world now, not just the UK. And basically, to summarise it, this is not the full critique. There were loads of other children that, I'm afraid, a number of other children that died. We're not entirely sure of the exact number, but at least 7. And they weren't listed. Now, have we just looked at the ones for whom Letby was on shift and said they're murders? I mean, you see, that reverses the logic. So that was completely a complete fallacy in terms of evidence, right? But it was unchallengeable because these days, the prosecutor gets he's had for a long time, I mean, most time, the prosecutor gets to make the opening statement. It used to be about 20 or 30 years ago when I first went to these courts longer ago, it would be about an hour. Now it's several days, and
Yeah.
with complete presentations and graphs on the wall, and so on. And so you're sitting there, and you've got this man whose job is to be persuasive, telling you this is what happened, and nobody can challenge him for 2 or 3 days. So that was the first thing, right? The second thing was the evidence given by an expert witness called Dowie Evans, and a lot of people have challenged that. I mean, 5 people referred him to the General Medical Council. I think it was turned down, but nevertheless, some very significant people referred him. And a lot of people have said that the argument he's made basically doesn't stand up. This is the air embolism. This is the idea of injecting air into the people. There's no evidence for it. It basically he's arrived at that by default.
So he was an expert witness, but I think he was accused of effectively prosecuting the case himself, wasn't he? Of coming up with theories rather than just giving an opinion on what he'd been presented with.
Yeah, there are lots of critiques of him in various ways, but in essence, what the people were saying was he basically created theories and hypotheses to create a case for the prosecution. He's employed by the prosecution, but that's what he did. And that's not what an expert witness should do. An expert witness should be a servant of the court, should actually tell the whole truth and so on. Now, he this air embolism argument, he based it on a paper written by a couple of people, one of whom called Shuley, who I've spoken to, who says he just doesn't accept. He says it's been completely misused. His research has been completely misused. That what they attribute as evidence is not evidence for an air embolism. That's his comment on it. And he was one of the people who was going to give evidence in the appeal that was turned down.
Right.
His evidence wasn't allowed.
Yeah. Is it not also the case that we talked about the Royal Statistical Society? They recommended, I think, didn't they, that statisticians should give instructions to juries on how to interpret data, not give evidence, but just instruct them on how to interpret data. That didn't happen in the Letby case and probably doesn't happen in other cases.
Doesn't happen generally. You see, I think one of the reasons this is important, why it's not Lord Longworth, why it's not the sort of slightly cranky thing. This is why it's important, is because the whole method of presenting expert data, statistical data, and so on, really needs to be rebuilt, recreated for the British courts. I think not just ours. I think lots of courts around the world. And the more and more scientific data, the more and more statistical data you have these days, with more data being available, from everything from phones to medical kit, you should have proper expert guidance, which is serving the court, not serving the prosecution or the defence.
Are you also concerned about some of the evidence relating to insulin apparently being injected into food bags, overfeeding, which came up in the trial, and also Letby was accused of physically abusing some of the babies with medical tools?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't got to the last couple yet, but the insulin one is normally speaking, I think, well, what I've been told by people who are at the top of their profession in this area, in neonatology, have said this is a very quirky result. If it had been normal, you would have gone back and just retested, from the laboratory, whether the thing was mislabeled or took too long to get there, or was it's a very, very tiny quantity of immune response to insulin that they're measuring, not actually insulin. So there's all of this data, every single one of itself, as far as I can see, doesn't stand up. But what happened was you had 10 months, effectively, of one after another, after another, after another of these slightly doubtful assertions being made. But the cumulative effect, I mean, I think we'd all be subject to it. You sit there and hear, well, that one might not be wrong, but the next one might, or the next one might, and that's part of the problem.
Can we just talk about a couple of the specific cases? Because as we heard Martin Evans saying, they didn't convict her on every charge. They spent a long time considering all of these charges. I think perhaps two of the most troubling cases, or two of the most clear-cut cases, shall we say. Child O, who suffered liver damage, which I think the prosecution suggested was akin to the sort of injury you might get in a high-speed car crash. There wasn't really a satisfactory explanation given, I don't think, for how that child came by those injuries. Do you feel that there is an explanation for that?
Yeah, I had somebody who spoke to me today about it, who said, this looks like, and this is a person whose was not at the trial, but is an expert in this area. So it looks like a quite rare condition. Now, I can't remember the title of the condition, but basically it amounts to bleeding from the liver into the liver capsule, and then suddenly that giving way. And so that it's not common, so it's not unusual that a junior staff wouldn't recognize it, but it happens.
Okay.
And so there is an the point being, with each of these things, that there is an alternative explanation. The other thing I'd say, just en passant on all of them, is that one of the critiques was that the prosecution presented these children as healthy, all right? And the truth is that's quite unlikely to be the case when they're 25, 26, 30 weeks gestation, when they sometimes weigh 2 pounds or even less, you know. And they said that it's not as unusual as is being represented that children like this collapse.
But there was another child I, Gordon, who had been very unwell and then been transferred to another hospital.
Yeah. This is so child I. Again, this is circumstantial, but it's an example of what the prosecution said was very strong circumstantial evidence. Child I, you'll know, David, was ill, suffered 3 unexplained collapses while Lucy Letby was on duty. The child was then transferred to another hospital where they made a full recovery. They were absolutely fine, so they went back to Chester Hospital where they were absolutely fine for 5 days. Those 5 days coincided with Lucy Letby being on leave. And then on the 6th day, when Lucy Letby came back from leave, the child died.
Yeah, well, I mean, as you say, it's circumstantial. And what you're sort of testing is the process I'm going through at the moment, and what August is going to be for me, which is to look at every single case and see if I can find one that seems to me to be a sort of slam dunk case, one that's clear. Because if I find one that's clear and says to me, yeah, Letby's actually guilty, I'm going to drop this. Understand that, right? That's why I'm going through this process, because you talk about 7, you've actually got more like 17 in terms of total numbers. And actually, when they started, they had 62 cases they were looking at. So the trouble is, if you take 17 from 62, you're going to find quite a lot of circumstantial evidence if you select them in a certain way. That's the problem with this whole statistical approach. It's dangerous.
Also, just in line with this suggestion that the evidence is circumstantial, there was a key witness, consultant paediatrician Dr. Ravi Jayaram, and he was the one who said she had been caught virtually red-handed trying to murder a premature baby by dislodging the breathing tube. But that's obviously been questioned, because how can you be caught virtually red-handed?
A synonym for virtually red-handed is not red-handed, I'm afraid. It's a terrible form of words in evidence. There is no such thing as virtually red-handed. I mean, some people I've talked to have been very scathing about that, but I haven't got to the second case
fair
yet.
Enough. Let's also just talk about Lucy Letby as an individual. I think one of the reasons why this case has caused a great amount of intrigue is not just the heinous nature of the crimes, but also the idea that this young nurse who dedicated all of her time to this neonatal unit, she had wanted to be a nurse from childhood because she herself had been a difficult birth. So there was this sense of trying to give back to the NHS that saved her. To all intents and purposes, she's hardworking. She's got no previous history of any wrongdoing. I mean, that is obviously confusing for people because she was the one volunteering for extra shifts all the time. She wanted to be in intensive care. She wanted to work with the babies that were the most sick because she found the other work not challenging enough.
Well, not only that, I mean, in a way, this biases the circumstantial evidence as well, because she lived on site. She was in the nurse's home. She was saving to buy a house, so she wanted to do as much overtime as she could. She was one of the most trusted amongst the nurses. One of the stories, I think, in the Daily Telegraph last week was one of the nurses wanted to give evidence and was put off by the hospital, of itself a worrying thing. And she was also one of the few fully trained neonatal nurses. I mean, again, people don't think in detail about this. Why should they? But a neonatal nurse is a very specialist profession in the sense that these babies are very vulnerable, they have barely any immune system, So, and she was one of the few that was actually fully qualified, and everybody trusted her.
So she's going to be on for the most difficult cases most of the time. So the nature of the lady, actually, and I've never met her, I've no connection with her whatsoever, but the nature of the lady seems to me to play into the prosecution's case in that it puts her on the spot so many times when there are crises going on.
Yeah. Can I ask you, David, what you make of the evidence that was found in Lucy Letby's home when it was searched? Let's just go through quickly. There were medical documents under her bed, including handover sheets, resuscitation records, blood gas readings. There were 257 sheets that she had under her bed, 21 related to children that she was accused of harming. She'd Google searched 11 of the families affected after the babies' deaths. She sent sympathy cards to the parents of some of her victims. There were those post-it notes which caused such a fury in court about, where she'd included phrases like help, I'm sorry that you couldn't have a chance at life, not good enough, why me, I haven't done anything wrong, I am evil, I did this, and I killed them on purpose because I'm not good enough to care for them. That's as close as we came to a confession, I think. Then we also had Letby's diary marked with initials of the dead babies on the days that they died. And then in court, she made this slightly odd statement where she broke down in tears, said she'd been made to feel as though she was incompetent, but she meant no harm. What's your take on all of those things?
Let's split it out a bit, shall we? I mean, firstly, all the taking papers home and so on, probably a sackable offence, I imagine. I don't know. I mean, but I would be my hunch because it's private data. But on the other hand, this could equally well be evidence of an incredibly conscientious person. Incredibly conscientious, who worries about her patients, who cares about the children, who cares about the parents, sending notes to them and so on. And in all of it, sometimes you think of the Sherlock Holmes, think of the dog that didn't bark, right? She's plainly somebody who's on Google all the time, on social media and Google and searching the web all the time. There's no sign of her searching, for example, air embolism, is there? Not once. And it's not something that you read in a normal textbook. There's no sign of her Googling, how to kill somebody with insulin, or how to cause a contusion of the liver. All of those things that she's supposed to have done. No sign of that at all. So, if you didn't know the backdrop, you'd say, this lady actually cares about her job desperately. That's the first thing. Now let's come to the post-it notes. I know some things about the post-it notes I can't yet tell because I haven't finished the investigation. But in summary, my view of this is a sign of somebody under great distress, processing, feelings of guilt. Now, if you're a nurse and you have failed, because that's how you would see it. If you're a really conscientious nurse, you've failed these babies because they have died, right? Then you can easily see how somebody would feel really guilty about this, would blame themselves. It's a well-known psychological phenomenon anyway, but you could see that. Somebody, I don't have it to hand, somebody went through and sequenced them all, actually worked out what the timetable was, and it drives a coach and horses through the argument this is a confession. It's not a confession. She didn't confess. She said throughout she didn't do it. So I don't attribute much evidence to that. I think the area I would look to is the physical evidence. Proper statistical analysis, proper medical analysis by the best in the world. And I think we're going to get that in due course. I think, because if nothing else, you've got a Thirlwall inquiry coming up, which is to look into it. Now, the Thirlwall inquiry is based on the premise that the conviction is sound. All right, yeah. But it will have to look into what is the alternative hypothesis here. What's the alternative theory as to why this happened? And there's already been a Royal College inquiry, which was, in the politest possible terms, was pretty critical of the hospital. Right, there were not enough nurses, there were not enough specialist doctors. The ward rounds were far too infrequent, twice a week rather than twice a day. There was a tendency not to call up the specialist if it was outside social hours and so on. all these things. There were issues about the hygiene. There were issues about nurses coming in when they're sick because they're short-staffed. There were issues about the competence of the junior doctors. I'm not blaming them. They just weren't. Their training wasn't necessarily up to what needed to be for this. Even talking about people Googling how to insert umbilical cannulae and so on. All of these things, they're not an individual's failure. They're a system's failure. They're the whole, and interestingly, Nadine Dorris, who wrote in the Mail about this, because she's an ex-nurse and she's actually had one of her babies delivered at this hospital, just reminded us our neonatal death rate is 30% above the OECD average. And we are pretty much the worst. So there's another question to answer, apart from Lucy Letby, is how guilty is the system in this? Because that's something we can put right. That's something we could actually fix.
The other thing that has troubled people who have been looking into this case is this sort of lack of motive. I mean, to this day, no one's really been able to establish why, beyond sort of boredom, thrill-seeking. It's been suggested that she was playing God. And then that begs the question, David, I mean, you said you don't know this woman. You're reading what you can over August. Is there not going to come a point where you just need to look into the whites of her eyes and make a judgment for yourself as to her guilt or innocence? I mean, would you, for instance, consider visiting her in prison?
Yes, I would. I mean, if I can. I mean, I may not be allowed to. Her lawyer may say no, she may say no, whatever. That's got to be with her permission, as it were. I don't know. So the answer to that question is yes. But to be honest, it wouldn't really affect the judgment. For me, this is a criminal case. Criminal cases are not judged on, or shouldn't be judged on what people look like. They should be judged on how they respond to a single question, unless it's a material question. It should be judged on the evidence. And there is, I can't remember, certainly what I'm probably going to have access to will be about 3 million words of evidence, which is all sorts of data. It's going to take all August to read. And that's the key. At the end of the day, that's the key. If that persuades me one way or the other, that will influence me. Then I will try and see her. But if it doesn't persuade me, then I won't waste the prison governor's time, and I won't try and influence myself emotionally. This is one of these things. All these battles has an enormous emotional thread too. I mean, as you can, the people are conscious of the post office one, but other ones. I mean, the Mullikin tyre crash, or all the things that I've done down the years. There's always an incredibly strong emotional thread, but you have got to separate yourself from that. The facts are the facts. The facts drive the outcome. The truth is what you're after, not particularly. I mean, you may have sympathy you probably do have sympathy for the victim, but that's not what drives it. It's got to be getting it right. It's got to be because there's so many people involved. The parents of the dead babies, future babies who go through the same system. Those are probably the people you must think about absolutely the most, and you can only do that on the facts.
Well, let's talk about the victims a little bit, David. So we have families here who've been ripped apart by what's happened. They've gone through years of torment. Let's just hear a statement by the victims' families read out after the first trial by a family liaison coordinator from Cheshire Constabulary.
Words cannot effectively explain how we are feeling at this moment in time. We are quite simply stunned. To lose a baby is a heartbreaking experience that no parent should ever have to go through. But to lose a baby, or to have a baby harmed in these particular circumstances, is unimaginable. Over the past 7 to 8 years, we've had to go through a long, torturous and emotional journey. From losing our precious newborns and grieving their loss, seeing our children who survived, some of whom are still suffering today, to being told years later that their death or collapse might be suspicious. Nothing can prepare you for that news.
David, I'm sure that gives you pause when you listen to that. Have you tried to contact any of the victims' families, or do you intend to as part of this process?
Not at this stage. I mean, as I said to you at the beginning, this is the process of me deciding, should I pursue this next few weeks, 4 weeks or 6 weeks? If I get to the point that I decide to go ahead with it, then I have to think about that. I don't look. I want to minimise the pain to anybody involved. But if I were in their position, I'd want the truth, And if it turned out that this woman has been wrongly convicted, and actually the truth is it's because the level of care wasn't appropriate or wasn't good enough, or because we should put more money into it, or because the training wasn't right, or the organisation wasn't right, or the hospital was trying to do things it was not equipped for, then that's a different answer. But it's just as important to get it right. And if I were a parent in that position, I'd want to know that.
If you did contact the parents, though, and if you did visit them, and if you had gone through all of this evidence and you had decided in your own mind that she was innocent, but you then met the parents of these children and they said to you, look, we sat through the whole trial, we don't agree with you, we're convinced that she's guilty, please don't do this, would you go ahead?
I'm not going through that process, but forgive me, but I'm not going through that process. What I have to decide is this a miscarriage? And frankly, I have every sympathy for the parents, but the end of the day, it doesn't help them, it doesn't serve them if a miscarriage is carried out in their name. It doesn't help them if the wrong answer's got. I mean, as I said, if I were a parent in this position, I think what I would want is the truth. And to done as efficiently as and quickly as possible. There will be the Thirlwall inquiry. It's going to happen. Yeah. I'm afraid this is not going to disappear. Even if you wanted it to, it won't disappear. And there have been previous cases on the continent. Lucy Letby and Poglia, almost parallel cases to this. Nurses who have been convicted, served some time in prison and then been released and completely exonerated because people have realised that the evidence was flawed, wrong, mispresented. And so, we need to look at this. And if it turns out that even if it's a mistrial but it's got the right answer, then as far as I'm concerned, I'll try and minimise the pain and walk away.
Yeah.
But if it's actually somebody being put in prison for the rest of their lives and having their name made something that people remember as a monster, angel of death, I think was the phrase used in one of the things, then that can't be let stand.
Gordon, David's left the studio now. It is an enormous risk, this. I mean, I appreciate what you're saying. I will look through the evidence all summer and come to a conclusion. And if I conclude that she's guilty, I'm dropping it. If he doesn't conclude that, it is going to cause offence to the families. I appreciate he's then said, well, we can't let emotion get in the way. If this is a miscarriage of justice, then I have to pursue it. But it's quite risky for him and his reputation.
Yeah, I think it was really important that he said that he's only going to carry on with this if he's convinced she's innocent, rather than if he's just convinced that the trial was badly handled, that her defence wasn't quite up to scratch. I do think that he probably needs to visit her in prison and convince himself by asking her directly before he proceeds with this. I think it would be quite difficult for him to go ahead with all this, put his reputation on the line, if he hasn't even been and seen her and asked her himself. That would be my feeling if I was in his position.
And also maybe speak to her parents, her friends, her supporters, as well as speaking to the victims' families and indeed the people on the other side of this. The difficulty with this case, and it's absolutely right that he should be poring over every detail of the paperwork that he manages to access, is the counter-narrative will always be, but hang on, you weren't in court. You didn't sit there for 10 months. Yeah. The jury, and Martin Evans, our crime editor, will vouch for this. The jury are there listening to it day in, day out. They took a huge amount of time to deliberate this verdict.
Yeah, and if something takes 10 months to play out, then it's difficult to see how he can get a grip of all that information in such a short space of time. He's talking about going through it in maybe the course of a month. I'm not sure how easy that is. But I think he probably won't be alone. I think there will be others who will come out of the woodwork. I know he thinks that there will be statisticians in particular who may well sort of come together and try and raise questions about this from an expert point of view. So I don't think he's going to be doing this completely alone.
No. Obviously, you might have your views on Lucy Letby. Do get in touch with us. The email is thedailyt@telegraph.co.uk. Also, you can contact us via our social channels on X, Instagram and TikTok. The handle is simply @dailytpodcast. And I should say, Gordon, we have written extensively about this case, and you can find all of those articles on the Telegraph website. If you simply Google Telegraph Lucy Letby, you'll find them all. That's us done for not just another day, Gordon, but another week. And it's been a pleasure presenting with you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us. Have you enjoyed it?
I have. And like I say, it's gone very quickly, which is always a good sign.
I'll be back on Monday, 5 p.m.